Don't even faintly think that we'll get that far in our lesson this morning. The title lesson, as Brother Dan said, is A Devoted Servant. You could look at this in a couple different ways. It's a lesson on how not to treat your enemies, or how to treat your enemies, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on. Saul versus David. In fact, to start us off, a few verses. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44 says, and this is Jesus Christ speaking, Sermon on the Mount, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Proverbs 25, 21, and 22 says, "If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink, for thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee." When you go to Romans 12, 18 through 21, you'll find that Paul, writing to the Romans, used some of that and expanded on it a little bit. Romans 12, 18 through 21 says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." As we look at this morning's lesson, again, you're going to see two individuals, David and Saul. And as we look at this, you're going to see David's response to the evil that Saul looks to apply to David, to use against David. The scriptures that we just read are commandments of God. They're not ask, they're not request, they're not if you can. But we are commanded to love our enemies, to bless them, to treat them in a good fashion, and to pray for them that despitefully use us. Now, has anybody ever failed? Don't raise your hands. You don't have to. Has anybody ever failed that? I know I have. That is a hard thing to struggle. Keep in mind, it's not an ask. It's an expectation that God places upon us as His people. Now, it should be easy for us, but we struggle with it ourselves as Christians. And in fact, 1 John testifies what about love? Love your enemy. What else? If you don't have love, you're not a Christ. And especially loving the brethren. If you don't love the brethren, how hard is it sometimes for us among ourselves? How many times do we get into spits and spats? And I might have spit just a little bit there, I don't know. How many times do we get into fusses among ourselves and treat one another as enemies instead of someone that God has commanded us and in fact indicated that it's an indication of our salvation? So it's important that we heed those words as we look at the verses this morning, and I don't know how far we'll get through this, but absolutely. Yeah, and let me amend that. So I would say this. God always wants us to do what's right. We can learn from our failures, but God does not ever give allowance for sin in our life. we're commanded to love, and our failure to love our enemies, our brethren, is still sin. And so I don't recommend it. I'll put it that way. Oh, God, yes. Yes, certainly God allows many things in our lives as lessons to us. And it comes, many of those lessons come from our sin. We sin. We sin often. I would speculate we sin daily. I know my life is full of sin, my failure to follow and do what He'd have me to do. That goes back to that thought of experience is oftentimes the best teacher. I would also say this, that you don't have to touch that stove to know it's hot. When you touch that stove and you hold your hand on it long enough, what's going to happen? You're going to carry with it the scars. And God doesn't want us to carry those scars with us. He would rather that we heed His word and do His will out of love for Him. So anyway, all right. Let's go on and get started here. 1 Samuel chapter 18. And if somebody would read the first 5 verses. All right. Here, as we begin in verse 1, it says, and it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, and this is David and Saul. Saul, after David had killed Goliath and stirred the army of Israel, and they had defeated the Philistines in the midst of overwhelming odds. Saul had inquired as who this young man was. Even though he had met David, I think here it's really more about where do you come from? What's your background? And there he replies that I'm the son of Jesse, the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And so he gives sort of the household that he's from. But then we enter into 18. After they had finished that conversation, Saul was drawn to David. The soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Now, what does that mean, knit? Say that again. Yeah. Like one, woven together. The relationship of them was, in today's vernacular, they would say tight. But it was woven as one. Now, some believe that Jonathan could have been as much as 20 years older than David. And, that's quite an age span if that's the case. I don't know that. I don't know that it tells us anywhere. There certainly would have been vast differences between these two, right? What's David's background? Shepherd from the family of Jesse. What was the prominence of the family of Jesse? Anything in particular? We're told anything special about Jesse and his family? No. Saul, on the other hand, Jonathan, I sort of gave part of it away. Jonathan is from where? He's a king's son. He's next in line for the throne. He's royalty of royal blood. That's a great divide. It's a complete difference in backgrounds. And yet, there was something that brought the two together. What do you think it was? It was the Lord. The Lord spans across all differences. As we sit here this morning, many of us have very similar backgrounds. You can look around and many have background that comes out of Arkansas. Why? because you sought the first opportunity to get out of Arkansas and did so. Um, we have different education. We have different jobs. We have vast differences. Some of us may have been raised from a young child in church, while others came to know Jesus Christ at a much later stage of life. Does it matter? Well, not when it comes to the Lord. We're all equal in the eyes of God, and we should treat and see each other in that same fashion. There were a lot of natural differences between Jonathan and David, but God brought the two together, and it was God that knit them in that fashion. Now, when you contrast that, here it indicates in verse 2, Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. So there was something there with Saul. And then in verse 5, and David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. What do we glean from this about the relationship between Saul and David? Do we see that same knit? There was a good relationship. Yeah, had already left Saul. So what was Saul's basis or premise for having a relationship with David? Why did he go back and ask, who is David and what household is he from? Because Saul had reaped the benefit of David. David, a saved individual given over to God, integrity, honesty, good character. Saul saw the benefits of David. Now we're going to find out he saw the benefits of David until all of a sudden he didn't see the benefits of David. Yeah, we're going to see that in these next verses. So Saul, it's important to see that there is a vast difference between Saul and even his son Jonathan. Jonathan, when we go back and we look at Jonathan taking his servant and going up to battle the Philistines, where was his reliance? Was it on himself? It was upon, he said, if God. And when David went before Saul and said, I killed a bear, I killed a lion, and I can kill the Goliath, the giant, because my God. And so that was, as we look at these three people, we see a tightness between those two that relied upon God. We see a beneficial interest from Saul toward David. Verse 4, Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, gave it to David, and his garment, even his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. What's significant about that? The things that he had. We go back. We talked about Israel going up against the Philistines, and the Philistines being having mass weapons of war, chariots and swords and spears. The children of Israel, who had swords? Two people, Saul and Jonathan. And the garb that, these garments that Jonathan wore, what was significant about them? What would be different from Jonathan and anybody else? He was the king's son. They were significant of his place and position. In giving them to David, I speculate, I believe that Jonathan was acknowledging David and that position that God had chosen for David. Now, maybe he didn't fully recognize it. I think he had an inkling. He saw something in David. Now, Jonathan had exhibited himself in a very brave fashion and relied upon the Lord. But there was something different and special about David. Yeah. And that's what I'm suggesting, is he may very well have recognized that David was the anointed of God. And gave him. Now, what does that tell you about Jonathan's character in addition to what we've already talked about? It's a good name for him, you kid, Jonathan. What else? What about his character? I mean, you think about his position. He accepted God's will, which oftentimes requires what from us? Submission, which ties in with an H word, humility. In spite of that high position. And the people looked to Jonathan because of what he had done. He still was very willing to step back and allow somebody else to step up. How many times does jealousy creep into churches? Oh, that person doing this or that person doing that. And we get jealous because somebody is gaining attention. Well, there's a problem there. There's a problem. We need to have that humility to let others step in and do the role that God would allow them to do or would have them to do. And allow ourselves to slide back. We don't have to be heard all the time. We don't have to be preeminent in all things. And so, I think that you see that occurring here. Verse 5, and David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, behaved himself wisely. How did David behave himself wisely? How was he able to do that? Through God. Sometimes I have to think, okay, how do I need to act in this certain situation, in this instance? Well, if we look to God, God will guide us through His Holy Spirit, through His Word. He tells us how to behave ourselves. And David was a man that, as we already read, was after God's own heart. Saul set him over men of war. Why? Because it was beneficial to him. He was accepted in the sight of all the people and also the sight of Saul's servants. So David made a good impression upon all those around him. What does that tell us about us in our daily walk? As we're out and about. Now, do you think that all of these Israelites trusted in Jehovah, followed after God? We'll find that even in David's house later on, that there's an idol there in David's own house. Now, he didn't bring it in, but it was there. And I think it was a problem still throughout much of Israel and would continue to be a problem. Well, anyway, all right. We need to allow God to lead and guide us in those things that we do, acting wisely, and wisdom comes from God, not from ourselves. We oftentimes get haughty. Oh, I'm so smart. I know how to do this. I know how to do that. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm not a wise person. There's a lot of things. When it comes to smarts, I don't have them. I look to a lot of other people oftentimes. And, well, anyway, I'll just move on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. That's right. Yeah. Now, does that mean that you're always standing back here silent, never saying anything? No, not at all. There are times when we have to stand up and we have to speak up. Joshua had to do that at times. Moses, who was timid, didn't want to lead God's people, had several times to step up and speak out in leading a rebellious people. So, all right. Any other thoughts or comments? I mentioned 1 John, loving the brethren. 1 John 4:11, 20 and 21 says, Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he's a liar. For he that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, how can he love God, whom he hath not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God loveth his brother also. All right. Matthew 5:16, as we're talking about David's witness before others. Matthew 5:16 says, Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works, and glorify not you, but the Father which is in heaven. 1 Peter 2:11 through 17 says, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts that war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So in those verses, we're clearly told that our lives should be a constant witness to others. We probably won't get to it, but we'll find out that David's influence was so great before men that it wasn't just effective toward his own people, Israel, but that the Philistines began to hear and to see the life of David and saw that he was a different man, very different than Saul, but different than men in general. So our lives should reflect that as we go about our daily business, at work, at school, wherever it might be, grocery shopping, in the restaurants, as we're complaining about our food, wherever it might be, that we are representing Jesus Christ and his love for the lost and dying mankind. All right. Any other thoughts? All right, 6 through 9. And it came to pass as they came when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, and this was after the slaying of Goliath and the defeat, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabret, with joy, with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and Saul had slain, and said, Saul had slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only 1,000, or thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David, that evil eye, that day and forward. So, what do we see in these verses? Yeah, jealousy rearing its ugly head. In verse 6, the women coming out and celebrating the victory. Is that unusual or unique? No, it's gone on all down through history. And in fact, you come right on up, and as late as World War II, we were celebrating our armies being victorious. Now, since then, we don't see a whole lot of celebration, even in the United States, even when I think it's in the right. We don't see a lot of celebration. But that's what they did then. So that was normal. They celebrated, and they came out to meet. Verse 7, the women answered one another as they prayed and said, Saul hath slain his thousands. Wow. What are they saying? Is that a compliment or is it a shot at Saul? Yeah. Now, had he actually killed 1,000, and had David actually killed 10,000? Probably not by numbers, but what they were suggesting and what they said was they have done great works for God's people. That's what they were saying. They might have. I don't know. It may be that Saul's actions and behaviors were so public that they all knew that. But it was not a disparaging comment at all. Had they stopped and had they said, Saul hath slain his thousands, how do you think Saul would have treated that if that's all they said? Oh, I think he would have been thrilled. He'd have been excited. Listen, they're singing my praises. Don't we like to hear their praises? Yeah. I'm sorry? Until somebody else is better, until somebody else receives praises, maybe more acclaim than another. Envy reared its ugly head here. Saul had killed thousands. Compliment. However, David's compliment was even greater. On the other hand, do you ever, and again, don't raise your hands, have you ever felt that way? Has jealousy or envy ever come into play? It happened with me. Have you ever begun to judge? Well, they're just doing it because.